much for coming. I guess the first thing is, who are you and what do you do? And why do you think that I've asked you to be here today?
Because we get on well.
We do, that's true.
Which I think is really important. I've been thinking a lot about only working with people that I like working with lately.
Yeah, it's nice.
And how, as a strange queer black woman artist, I often have to work with people in order to advance my career and pay my bills.
Yes.
And I'm trying really hard to get to a place where I don't have to work with people.
To find the other strange people. Yes.
Yeah, you know, all their strange work with my strange, you know, or whatever. And like it's a pleasurable experience working together, and that's something that has become rare and a luxury, especially for those of us who don't walk the line. So I'm demanding that. And one of the reasons I'm demanding that is because I identify as a pleasure activist, which is a term that I came across through Adrienne Marie Brown's work, who's an amazing, many things, pleasure activist, science fiction writer, speculative kind of gatherer of many different conversations and peoples and species that have and probably will exist. I feel like she is herself a kind of archive or a librarian in this beautiful kind of non-temporally bound space of love and pleasure driven activism and survival. And I kind of came to looking at pleasure through my work on climate change, and more specifically climate colonialism, which essentially means the way that climate change is a legacy and a result of European colonization on the global south and many parts of the world through, extraction, trade, the transatlantic slave trade, and massive kind of deforestation, the creation of what I'm looking at the moment is quite interesting, the creation of conservation laws across kind of, a lot of them began in India and then developed kind of across different colonies, and then later came to Africa, and how those conservation laws were kind of used to co-opt sacred lands or lands that had been deliberately not fished or not hunted for different kind of spiritual reasons, which were environmentalist reasons, and then they were kind of taken by the colonial state, and it was very much used as a way of occupying land, and continues to be. The Green Movement continues to be in many different spaces a colonially driven white supremacist movement. So I was doing a lot of that work, and I got into that work through performance and through a post-colonial MA, which I did at Goldsmiths, and also through my family's Ghanaian, and I grew up between Ghana and the UK, and all the beaches that I used to go to when I was a kid, a lot of them aren't there anymore, or a lot of them, only half of them are there, and so it was really a very personal, like, what the hell happened to this beach, and kind of like following that conversation through, and then and connecting the intellectual history and intellectual present with the literal materiality of losing parts of my home, and needing to understand why and how that was happening, and needing to have conversations with people all the time in Ghana about that this is a political issue, this is a colonial issue, the beach is not just gone because it's just gone. You know, there's like a reason, and there's a how, and there's somebody who's benefiting, and somebody who is not benefiting, and those people are often black and brown people, often women, often queer and trans communities, often children, almost entirely, first and foremost, in the global south. So I got into pleasure because that work was kind of destroying my mental health, basically. Doing that research, learning more and more, coming to kind of the realization that climate change is like knowing all the intricate ins and outs and having endless reports on the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade kind of tenfold in advance, and knowing that's all going to happen, and how it's going to happen, and who's going to die, and how many people, and how many generations, and how many pieces of land, and how many species, and having endless reports, and knowing they're predominantly black, brown, and indigenous, and everybody knowing, and life carrying on. So that kind of destroyed my mental health but I really felt like I needed to keep doing this work. So I got interested in pleasure as a kind of mode of survival whilst navigating climate change, research and conversation, and also going to Johannesburg and presenting a paper on climate change in South Africa, and realising how violent it was for me to be there as a British citizen, as a light-skinned person, as a non-South African, and present a paper full of the death of their families, essentially, in numbers, even though that's exactly what I was talking against doing. That is totally what I did. It was the first paper I'd ever presented at a conference, and I kind of came away and I was like, that was really fucked up that happened. And I don't know if I could have realised that before doing it, but it's something I've tried to never ever do again. And I've realised it's a conversation I need to find a way to have in a way that is empowering and is full of potential as opposed to full stops. Which most conversations around climate change are full of full stops, and it's been researched, written up, and disseminated in that way, kind of on purpose, and in order for to present something which we cannot change, which we cannot do anything about because it's all going to happen. So you might as well just continue to have 3 cars and 4 kids, and go on holiday every 2 months on a plane. And also because a lot of the scientists who got funding and get funding to do that work are white, cis, North American or Western European or Scandinavian men whose entire epistemology, their entire way of understanding what knowledge is and how knowledge is made and how to communicate knowledge is through an incredibly narrow, patriarchal, non-emotionally engaged lens, which means that they don't actually have any tools to present a thing which isn't full of full stops and facts which make us feel like we can't do anything about it. So I try to present that knowledge and do that learning in a different way, and one of the ways the main way that I do that is through science fiction and speculative work, because it's what I love, it's what I've always read and been fascinated by, because I always wanted to write science fiction with like fat black queer girls in it, which I never read and never knew could happen, and I always wanted to, not always, not just a little, but now I like to write science fiction with really great queer sex scenes in it, and super like hot, poly, baby conceiving, Treeborgian species creations, and lots of like tentacular like fucking that happen. It's really hot. I try and write really hot like climate change fiction, because we could all do I genuinely that's my at the core of my political belief is all forms of pleasure. And that's how we survive. And that's how we survive with a remnant of something which is not just complete despair. Yeah. Because right now, what we're leaving is violence and despair. Often, not always. And plenty of people are doing phenomenal work all over the world. But often. So that's who I am. I guess that's why you invited me. Yeah. And I
have a question, which is so we're encouraged specifically in a neoliberal period of time to, I guess, silo our issues, right? And so you have pleasure activism and environmental justice and racial justice as separate areas through which you can understand the world. But what you're showing me, and what kind of is in the tradition of black feminist organising and thinking and pedagogy, is this kind of intersectionality. And I don't want to have a conversation about intersectionality per se, because I think we have a lot of conversations about that word, and we can actually have a conversation about your practice and the ways that you're thinking about all of those things, and the ways that this residency has been kind of structured without using that that specific word, because I think then it becomes this sort of checklist. Is it intersectional? And it's like that there are multiple ways to do that practice, right? So, but can you speak a little bit more about, so when I say racial justice is environmental justice, you understand what I mean because you have that understanding of all the ways that they overlap. So can you speak a little bit more before you do your reading about how speculative fiction and pleasure activism and racial justice and environmental justice are not these siloed things that you can choose which one you dedicate your life to, but are intimately and always and already linked to each other.
I will talk about it as much as I can. I think it's that articulating that concisely is a really hard thing to do. It's something I'm still trying to do because it's something that I feel. And when I actually really find the word intersection really problematic for lots of reasons, but also because it's the idea that there are sections that need to be entered, and actually they're not sections.
Right.
They were never sections. So even intersectional is almost like a post-colonial decolonizing.
I mean,
and I'm like, so I kind of want to rather than I kind of want to give you more of like a pre-intersectional pot.
I mean, I think the word intersectional, it comes from a critique of the fact that those things are siloed and those things are sectioned, but it also maybe falls into
and
that.
lots of love for,
Kimberly.
Lots of love for Kimberly Crenshaw. But I just need to say that.
No, I think it's important to continue to be critical, right? And continue to also notice the ways in which we're falling into the traps that we're trying to avoid.
Totally. So I've just started a PhD, and the PhD is on inherently environmentalist pleasure practices in Ghana and Kenya, and how they might produce sensual strategies for climate colonialism resistance. That is something that very few people I've said it to kind of go, oh yeah. Right. Which is partly because of the words, but it's also because, pleasure, Africa, climate change, colonialism, really, happens in the Western brain. There are a few people I've said that to, one of who's an amazing artist called Ahi Lapalapa Rands, who's an indigenous Pacific Islander artist, and Hawaiian, who was like, oh yeah, obviously. And I think that is the way that I'm going to answer your question, because I think the whole point of my PhD now has become, how do I find a way to articulate this so that people go, oh, yeah, obviously. Because obviously the way that I relate to my environment has got to be a sensual one, and obviously an attack on the environment is an attack on my body in the same way that it would be an attack on my sister or of my lover or of my child. And obviously that's a sensual, physically wounding relationship for my body, and obviously that's linked to colonialism, and obviously the only way we can think about talking about that, or one of the only ways, is to imagine the futures that have been erased by colonialism, by decolonization and the structural adjustment programs, by neoliberalism and globalization. So maybe I'm going to say that, and then I'm going to say that the story tries to do, or all of my fiction tries to do that question without me articulating it to you in loads of jargon. It tries to give you the feeling that I feel.
So just quickly thank you for that response. Before we move on to your reading, I came across a statement, or somebody's response to a statement, which has stuck with me, and I'm not sure where it came from, and then I did some research to try and figure out where it came from, and I think it's around the intersection of sort of pleasure activism, feminism, and kind of ecological environmental justice. But it's this idea that nature is not your mother, nature is your lover.
Oh, I know where that came from.
And so I wanted to ask you if you did, and also what does that mean to you, or does it mean anything to you, or what is that thing?
I don't know where it came from.
Well, if you could tell me where it came from, then we can talk about it together.
Okay. After or no?
No. I mean, is it something that I shouldn't be dwelling on.
Totally talk about it.
Okay.
No. I think it's something that's interesting to dwell on.
I think for me, it changed. I mean, we're taught to kind of relate to nature as a provider, right?
Yeah.
As something that provides something for us so that we can live. And there's no...
And something that dies. Something after it's given us what we need.
Yeah,
as well, right?
but something that, like, its main purpose...
Yeah.
is in our kind of core survival mode is to give us what we need. And you know, all of these things destroying the environment, you know, we shouldn't be doing this because Mother Nature will provide for us and we're stopping that happening, right? But if you conceive of or think about nature as your lover, then I mean, how do you treat your lover? What is the relationship that you have? It is much more reciprocal. It is much more like there is a kind of requirement that you care for each other, which is a new way of relating. And I wondered how that feeds into your work.
Yeah, I think with lots of these kind of catchphrases, they are re-articulations of Indigenous knowledge.
Of course.
Right. So
because when I tried to research it, it was white women. Yeah. And I was like, really though? So that's is that where it first came from?
Yeah.
Because, or where else does that core idea come from?
But I think there's a usefulness to those two particular white women.
Can't remember their name.
No, I know their names. I'm just checking that both people identify as women. I think there might have been a change. So that white woman and her partner, who I will name in a minute, but I'm going to not name them because those names have, if you know who they are, they have a reputation, and I want to just talk about it before I name them. There's like a role that those people have played in putting that catchphrase on the map and getting people to think differently about the environment because they have a platform, because of the nature of their privilege, and also because of the specific art spaces they come out of, which is really interesting, and academic spaces they now inhabit, interestingly. But they've also monetized that statement, and that it's become kind of a brand, and they sell it by doing workshops, and they move around doing those workshops, and I don't actually think there's anything wrong with that because they're sharing this interesting thing, but it's within the system of capitalism, and that's important to kind of know. And as far as I know, there's no attributing to any Indigenous cultures that comes from, which is a problem. For me, it's completely obvious, I guess, and I never really thought of the environment as my mother. I thought of it as quite a brutal teacher, you know, like I really thought of it as like quite a harsh, like loving harsh, like my Ghanaian aunties kind of thing, you know, but not aunties like maternal, but aunties like with the weight of years. Aunties like as in experience, I guess, and respect for my elders. So there was very much like a respect kind of relationship. So I never thought of us as being on par, but I definitely kind of never thought of it as a maternal relationship. So I think as lover, it's that makes a lot more sense to me.